Visualize this atmosphere. A sun-drenched main street in a frontier settlement. The sun hangs high above. A man, distinguished by a tin badge on his chest, stands in solitude, his hand poised near his weapon. He embodies judicial authority, beholden solely to his personal moral compass. His objective? To cleanse the town, dispense justice with swiftness, and vanish into the sunset. This portrayal of the United States Marshal has been ingrained in us by Hollywood for a century. From cinematic icons like John Wayne to Matt Dillon, we've been led to believe these figures were self-sufficient champions who governed the Western territories with absolute dominion and rapid firearm deployment. Yet, what if I told you that nearly everything movies taught us about U.S. Marshals is inaccurate? What if the real Marshal was less of a solitary figure and more of a bureaucratic functionary with a badge? What if drawing his weapon actually represented a significant financial setback, potentially costing him a month's earnings? The reality of the Old West Marshal was far more rugged, intricate, and, frankly, more captivating than the myths presented on screen. Today, we will unveil the true, often unglamorous, logistical complexities of federal law enforcement in the late 19th century, stripping away the cinematic overlay. Part 1. To truly grasp the essence of the actual U.S. Marshal, one must understand their true employers. In films, a marshal arrives in a town and seemingly takes command, apprehending intoxicated cowboys, de-escalating saloon brawls, and pursuing bank robbers. However, in reality, a U.S. Marshal possessed scant authority over such matters. The U.S. Marshal Service, established in 1789, was conceived not as a police force, but as the enforcement arm of the federal judiciary. This is a critical distinction. A marshal was not a municipal officer. He did not patrol streets seeking confrontation. Instead, he typically awaited a judge's directive. His role was to execute lawful mandates, that is, to serve warrants, subpoenas, and writs issued by a federal judge. If a cowboy, in a drunken state, discharged his firearm in a saloon, this constituted a state or municipal offense, which fell under the purview of the local sheriff or town marshal. The U.S. Marshal lacked jurisdiction unless the crime occurred on federal land, such as a military outpost or post office. This often led to tensions, rarely depicted in movies. While films often show marshals and sheriffs collaborating, or the marshal assuming control, the county sheriff, in reality, reigned supreme in his territory. Elected by the local populace, the U.S. Marshal, conversely, was a political appointee dispatched from Washington. They frequently found themselves in competition, vying for territorial influence and, more significantly, for the right to claim apprehended individuals. Why? Because in the Old West, prisoners were a source of income. Part 2. This leads us to the most significant misconception regarding Western lawmen: finances. In films, the protagonist acts out of a sense of duty, driven by righteousness. However, in the actual 1800s, U.S. Marshals and their deputies were motivated by an entirely different factor: the fee system. Until 1896, Deputy U.S. Marshals did not receive a fixed salary or bi-weekly paychecks. Instead, they were compensated for each task performed, much like a factory worker or a commission-based salesperson. Payment was contingent upon executing specific government-sanctioned tasks, each with an assigned cost. Let's examine the financial structure, as it profoundly influenced law enforcement in the West. According to the fee schedule in Arkansas and the Indian Territory, a deputy earned $2 for an arrest. The nature of the crime, whether chicken theft or murder, was irrelevant. The government paid a flat $2. The real financial incentive lay in mileage. A deputy received 6 cents per mile for travel to an arrest location and 10 cents per mile for transporting the prisoner back. This spawned a practice known as mileage making. Deputies would deliberately overlook nearby outlaws, instead riding hundreds of miles to apprehend a distant target, solely to accrue travel fees. This transformed the pursuit of justice into a strategic game of maximizing distance. The fee system also clarifies why the dead or alive warrant is largely a cinematic fiction. If a deputy shot and killed a suspect, how much was he paid? Nothing. He received no arrest fee because he couldn't present the individual to the court. He earned no mileage for the return journey without a prisoner. In fact, he often had to cover the outlaw's burial expenses himself. Thus, the notion of a trigger-happy marshal indiscriminately shooting people in the streets makes no financial sense. A deceased suspect represented a financial loss. A shrewd marshal desired their prisoner to be alive, well, and in their custody, ready to convert that voucher into cash at the journey's conclusion. Part 3. This brings us to the mundane aspects of the job, which comprised roughly 90% administrative tasks and 10% action. Movies highlight gunfights, but omit the extensive hours dedicated to completing expense reports. Every expenditure made by a deputy required documentation. If he purchased breakfast for a detainee, he had to itemize it, 25 cents. If he acquired corn for his horse, 50 cents. These meticulously detailed vouchers were dispatched to Washington, D.C., where Department of Justice clerks meticulously reviewed them. These clerks, likely unfamiliar with frontier realities, frequently denied expenses deemed superfluous. Imagine a deputy risking his life to apprehend a band of outlaws, only for the government to refuse reimbursement because he lacked a proper receipt for horse fodder. This was a common occurrence. Marshals perpetually faced financial strain, often waiting months for government reimbursement. Their struggle extended beyond confronting bandits. They were engaged in a bureaucratic conflict with Washington. The most formidable figure in a marshal's life wasn't Billy the Kid. It was the auditor at the Treasury Department. Part 4. Another inaccuracy perpetuated by Hollywood concerns the typical appearance of a marshal. In classic Western films, the U.S. marshal is almost exclusively depicted as a white man. However, historical records reveal a starkly different reality. The U.S. Marshal Service in the Indian Territory was arguably the most racially integrated law enforcement agency in American history. Given the inherent dangers of the job and the inconsistent compensation, the service could not afford to discriminate based on race. They required individuals who were resilient, intimately familiar with the terrain, and adept with firearms. This fostered a meritocratic environment on the frontier. The most renowned example is Bass Reeves. Born into slavery in Arkansas, Reeves evolved into one of the most effective deputy marshals ever, serving for over 3 decades and credited with arresting more than 3,000 felons. He was a master detective, employing disguises and fluent in several Native American languages. Unlike cinematic heroes who rely on quick draws, Reeves utilized his intellect. He once trekked 28 miles with 2 captured prisoners to avoid a potential shootout. Yet he wasn't alone. There was Grant Johnson, of mixed African-American and Chickasaw descent, celebrated as one of the territory's finest lawmen. In New Mexico, Hispanic U.S. Marshals, such as Romello Martinez, commanded white deputies. This dynamic, a Hispanic superior issuing commands to Anglo cowboys, is seldom portrayed in films, yet it accurately reflected the political landscape of the Southwest. The West was a melting pot, and the individuals who donned the badge embodied that diversity. Part 5. Now, let's address the depiction of violence. We are all familiar with the scene. The clock strikes noon, the street empties, and two men confront each other. They draw, and the swifter victor emerges. This scenario is dramatic, suspenseful, and largely fabricated. Professional law enforcement officers in the Old West deliberately avoided fair fights, recognizing them as a rapid path to demise. Marshals favored the element of surprise. They would encircle a cabin at dawn and order the suspect to surrender. Their objective was to neutralize the outlaw before they could access a weapon. And when forced into confrontation, they did not rely on precise pistol shots at 50 paces. A handgun served as a secondary weapon. If a marshal anticipated trouble, a Winchester rifle was secured to his saddle. The rifle was the primary instrument of their trade, offering superior range, accuracy, and stopping power. The quick-draw artist is a myth born from dime novels and refined by Hollywood stunt performers. Furthermore, the law was quite rigid regarding when a marshal could discharge a weapon. The legal principle of the fleeing felon rule stipulated that a lawman could only employ lethal force if absolutely necessary to prevent the escape of an individual who had committed a felony. If a marshal shot a man who was subsequently found to be unarmed or guilty of only a minor offense, that marshal could face murder charges. This was not merely theoretical. Deputies were frequently apprehended by local sheriffs following shootings, necessitating legal counsel and jury trials. There was no blanket license to kill. Every bullet fired had to be legally and financially justifiable. Part 6. Finally, we must consider the immense physical demands of the profession. When a marshal embarked on patrol across the vast territories, he wasn't simply riding a horse. He was orchestrating a logistical operation. A typical patrol might extend for 2 or 3 weeks. The marshal would lead a chuck wagon, complete with a cook and driver. As they traversed the territory serving warrants, they would accumulate prisoners. These detainees required sustenance, constant guarding, and transportation back to the federal court. Imagine a wagon traversing the plains, carrying 10 or 12 desperate individuals, murderers, whiskey runners, horse thieves, all shackled together. This was colloquially known as a chain gang on wheels. The deputy's slumber was always disturbed, often restrained to the wagon wheel, or even to the detainees themselves to foil any breakouts. It was a wretched, squalid, and strenuous life. Should a captive fall ill and succumb to pneumonia while en route, the deputy forfeited his payment and faced an inquiry. The idealized image of the solitary horseman disappears when one comprehends that these individuals basically ran a portable detention center across some of North America's most unforgiving landscapes. As we dismantle the Hollywood fantasies, the U.S. Marshal emerges as a far more relatable persona. He was not an unassailable champion. He was an individual striving to perform a perilous occupation for meager compensation. He was a man who fretted about his offspring's footwear, who bickered with government functionaries over the expense of horse fodder, and who depended more on his intellect than his shooting prowess. The authentic narrative of the U.S. Marshals is a saga of fortitude, varied backgrounds, and steadfastness. It chronicles figures such as Bass Reeves and Grant Johnson, who upheld the law in regions where their presence was often unwelcome. It is a tale of administrative duties, muddy pathways, and the harsh financial realities of endurance. So, the next occasion you view a Western and observe the protagonist dispatching 3 adversaries and riding off nonchalantly, just recall that the genuine marshal would have been fumbling for a voucher and hoping the government would compensate him for the ammunition. I have affixed a remark underneath, and I eagerly await your perspectives. Kindly like, subscribe, and activate that notification chime to ensure these narratives endure.